There are many people in this country who think that cannabis should be legalised. There are many people who think that it would cause the end of all sorts of drug gangs, that it would cause the end of all sorts of illegal activity. There are others, of course, who are not so sure. But what's interesting is that in recent times we have seen 3 separate MPs being taken across to Canada by an shall we say, an organisation which is behind, shall we say, the decriminalisation of drugs. And they've gone to Canada to find out whether the impact of making cannabis, in fact, legal is a good thing or a bad thing. Let's talk to Sir Norman Lamb, former Health Minister, currently Chair of the Science and Technology Committee, about the trip. Sir Norman, a very good morning. Welcome.
Morning.
This is quite an interesting project you got yourselves involved in. Tell us how it came to pass.
Well, I was invited along with a Labour and Conservative MP to go to Canada, really to see how their new legal regulated market for cannabis is working in practice and what lessons we can learn in the UK from that experience, really.
Right, and I mean, basically, it's a documentary which is going out, I believe, on Newsbeat, I think, on Radio 1, and it's on the BBC iPlayer as well.
Yep.
What did you expect to find, and what was the most surprising thing that didn't happen?
Well, look, I'm a committed reformer. I've believed in the case for reform for some time, so it wasn't something that changed my mind. If anything, it reinforced my view that the sensible approach to take is to regulate and to legalise, taking it away effectively from organised crime, which is what controls the market in the UK. I think what was interesting in Canada was meeting senior police officers who've been put onto the working group that have been set up by the government to advise on establishing a regulatory framework. And these senior police officers had started off very sceptical about the case for legalisation, but had been persuaded that it made sense. It relieves the pressure on police forces. It frees up resources for them to pursue serious crime. But it also undermines the criminal market. At the moment, we hand billions of pounds every year to organised crime. We don't take any tax revenue, of course, from it. And there is extreme violence associated with the illegal market in the UK, and it usually affects the poorest communities in our country. And the really interesting thing that has just emerged in the United States has been a study published in an American medical journal, which shows that in the states where they've legalized cannabis, use amongst teenagers in the United States has gone down. And for me, that's the great prize. I advocate legalization not because I'm into drugs. I'm instinctively quite hostile to the risky use of drugs, legal or illegal. But I think there's a better approach to particularly protecting young people than the approach we take at the moment.
And what's the reason, do you think, or do they know, why consumption has gone down amongst young people if it's legalised?
Well, if you legalise it and you make it available through regulated outlets, a lot of people who are currently buying through the criminal market will shift and buy legally.
Right.
That undermines the criminal market. And so, whereas in the UK at the moment, any teenager, for example, can get cannabis wherever they live across the entire United Kingdom. Once you start to undermine the criminal market, if it becomes less profitable, then it diminishes and it becomes harder to access. And just as with cigarettes and alcohol in our country, although, of course, there are some young people, some people underage who drink alcohol and smoke tobacco, we, of course, recognise that. It's harder to get hold of it underage if it's actually legal and regulated. And the evidence from the United States shows that appears to be exactly what's happening.
Sure. And so you're saying that they buy less of it because it's less freely available, in other words?
Exactly. It might also, interestingly, become slightly less attractive, exciting to young people.
Yeah.
Once it becomes legal and regulated, you're not being quite as sort of dangerous and challenging to your parents and to others.
And I guess if it's like 9 o'clock at night and you have to go somewhere to a shop to buy it where it's legal and sold and the shop's not open, then you can't get your hands on it. But interesting, I wanted to ask you about your experiment while you were there, because I understand you used cannabis oil in the documentary. What were the circumstances of that?
Yeah, I did. So I had heard. I'm not interested in the use of cannabis for sort of recreational purposes.
Right.
I get slightly sort of anxious about the idea of a sort of psychoactive effect on you. So, but I'd heard that cannabis can be very good for helping you to sleep. Of course, if you do a transatlantic flight, you get jet lag. I was conscious that when I came back to the UK, I had a select committee hearing. So I wanted to get some sleep. So I wanted to see for myself, are the claims that people make for cannabis justified? So I bought through a regulated outlet, with the BBC, of course, filming it all. And I thought, I mean, in a way, it sort of demonstrates how ludicrous it is, because the very mundane act of putting 3 or 4 drops of cannabis oil under your tongue before going to sleep seems to me like an unexciting, uneventful sort of thing to do. And yet it is a criminal act in the UK. And so it rather demonstrates just how ludicrous I think the current rules are in the UK.
Although I think the chances of actually being punished for doing so are very limited. I think that you're right to say that it's technically a criminal act, but there's not much criminalisation going on, I don't think, of anyone doing it.
Yeah, but I've got a constituent middle-aged man who uses cannabis for pain relief following a very serious injury to his leg. It's the only thing that relieves the pain. His home was raided, and he's ended up with a police caution, which goes on his record, which probably will make it more difficult for him to visit his son in Australia. And does it really make sense in public policy terms for the police to be spending their time dealing with someone who's using cannabis for pain relief? And even though the numbers of prosecutions and cautions are going down, there are still thousands every year across the country, and it's quite a postcode lottery. In some areas, police have effectively decriminalised, such as in Durham. But in other areas, such as Norfolk, you can still end up with a criminal record.
Sure.
That doesn't seem to me to be very sensible.
No, I get that. And I know you've got to go. Just one final point, because I was watching, and you'll be interested in this. I was in California recently, and the stench of marijuana smoke was quite overpowering walking down Hollywood Boulevard, I have to say.
Yeah.
And one of the problems they have there is they're not sure how many people are driving around in cars, because it's a very car-driven society, who are stoned, effectively. But the other more interesting thing, I was watching a Channel 4 report the other week, where in Mexico, because of the legalization of cannabis in most states of the western side of America, basically the drug cartels have stopped producing marijuana, and now they're producing effectively sort of artificial morphine and selling that across the border. And so they've actually gone into a more dangerous drug business than they were in, because they can't make any more money out of cannabis.
Well, there appears to be evidence that in the states bordering Mexico, levels of violence have gone down, which is a positive thing because of the undermining of the criminal market. Quite whether there is the same market for the sort of substances you're referring to, I somehow doubt.
Well, have a look at this documentary. Honestly, it's a real eye-opener.
Yeah, look, I, for example, and like you, I don't like the smell of cannabis. But the fact is that in our country now, lots of people are using it, and indeed, no doubt, driving after using it. There should be very tough penalties for anyone using cannabis before driving, just as there are for people who drink alcohol. We've just had a wonderful example of horrific scenes on a cruise ship where people have behaved appallingly after using alcohol, which is a legal substance. There are worse consequences of alcohol. It's a more dangerous drug in all sorts of ways than cannabis, and it seems to me to make sense as a harm reduction approach to regulate it rather than leaving it in the hands of criminals.
OK. Sir Norman, thank you very much indeed. Sir Norman Lamb, MP for North Norfolk, former Health Minister himself, currently chair of the Science and Technology Committee. That particular Canadian trip and the whole documentary, which you can see, as I say, on the iPlayer, was put together by Voltface, which is an organisation we've spoken to in the past a few times. They're an advocacy organisation, which seeks to reduce the harm drugs pose to individuals and society. I'm not necessarily against the idea of controlling and legalising the sale of marijuana. However, I am worried about what would happen next, because basically the drug gangs that deliver the marijuana, the drug gangs that manufacture the marijuana, the drug gangs that make money from the marijuana would just make money from something else, wouldn't they? Which is what they're doing in Mexico. So Norman hasn't seen that report that I saw, but I can tell you there is plenty of violence in the part of Mexico where they're making the fake morphine and where they're making the crystal meth, which they transport and smuggle up into the United States of America, which is causing more and more deaths in America, funnily enough. So it's not all sweetness and light just because you make marijuana legal.